Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever everyone's time zone is. My name is Karl Skoretsky. Welcome to Bar-Ilan University. I'm Dean of the Israeli Faculty of Medicine here in Sfat, in the Galilee of Israel. And I welcome you to the fifth in our series of 5 webinars, overall entitled, in a very prescient fashion. If you think about this title, just amazing to me. Michael Edelstein will introduce very briefly this evening, introduce our guest speaker, entitled the series, When the End is Just the Beginning, the COVID-19 Vaccine Challenge. And this name came up quite a long time ago and is absolutely, thoughtful ahead of time or prescient. And Michael, as I've introduced, I think many of you, I'm glad to see some of the same attendees and participants. It's fantastic. As you no doubt now remember, is an associate professor here at our faculty, Israeli Faculty of Medicine, in population health, moved to Israel just recently from London, born in France, studied medicine at the University of Birmingham, and then specialized and trained in practice and research in public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and is very well experienced in infectious disease epidemiology, health disparities, with many posts worldwide, and many publications, and many positions of importance in the world of academic public health. And he put together this series. I now invite Michael, welcome Ravit Barkama, on behalf of Bar-Ilan, and invite Michael to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Ravit, more formally. Michael, please.
Carl, thank you very much. I'm just checking I'm not on mute. No, I'm not. And Dr. Barkama, thank you very much for joining us. It's tonight here in Israel. And I just want to briefly introduce you to the audience before I give you the floor. So Dr. Ravit Barkama is the Assistant Vice President of Clinical Development at Holy Name Medical Center in New Jersey, where she focuses on medical research and clinical innovation. And she's responsible for bringing cutting-edge technology and new drugs to patients before they're approved for commercial use. And she was responsible for bringing pluriselm cell-based therapy to Holy Name in the fight against COVID-19. Before she joined Holy Name, she was the lead for cardiology research at Columbia University Medical Center, and prior to this was active in the Israel medical device industry, focusing on new technology and clinical research. So she brings a lot of expertise in innovation in clinical care, which I think is obviously extremely relevant in the times that we're in. So Dr. Barkama, thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So here right now, it's 11 a.m., but it's raining, so it might be as dark as it is over there. So let me just share my screen. Whoops. Let me go to the beginning. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so a little bit of the voice from the field, boots on the ground. So as Dr. Edelstein gave that very kind introduction, I'll share with you a little bit about Holy Name Medical Center, where I currently work. So this is just sort of what the entrance looks like. And we are situated about 5 miles from Manhattan. So all of you are familiar with the epicenter of COVID and how it hit this area in March earlier this year. Just as a little bit of, before we go and talk a little more about vaccines and the status there, I do want to share with you a little bit of a few stories and feel and with photographs of what it's like to be at the epicenter of a pandemic, and how our response was, and I'm proud to say that I think we responded in obviously with the circumstances in a very impressive way. So let me take you a little bit through that story. So you're all familiar, obviously, with the crisis in New York City. So on the top left, you can see the tents in Central Park, part of Mount Sinai Health. In the lower left, there's the USS Comfort, the healthcare ship, the hospital ship. It's huge, that came to help in New York City. The top right is the Javits Center, which really became like a field hospital with tons of beds. And below, just what from a newspaper, that the New York hospitals are, and they indeed were, overwhelmed. So 5 miles away from there, as I said, Holy Name, we engage in preparedness really fast. So one of the things we did is start with creating negative pressure rooms, which we had maybe 6 in the whole hospital, but we expanded to having about room for about 300 patients with negative pressure. So what you can see here in the top left is are the pipes coming from the rooms to fans on the roof. So basically this negative pressure enables air exchange in hospital rooms or in the patient rooms about 13 to 15 times an hour. In order to improve and to make it more efficient, on the bottom right, what you see is what we call the isopods. It's a smaller volume, and again, connected to pipes that go out to fans outside to enable air exchange. But because of the lower volume of these personal patient isopods, we can achieve an air exchange of 370 times an hour. So you understand, obviously, what that does. If you've got patients that are exhaling the virus, obviously with that air exchanger, with all that air going out to the atmosphere, obviously that helps to protect the staff from getting infected. So most probably the majority of our staff that was infected with COVID, most of them got infected in the community. We know that by tracing families and so forth. We did have some infections in the hospital, but that was the minority. So just about further what our facilities did, if you look here, this is a peek into an ICU room. A regular ICU room, like there are in many other countries, in order to treat the patient, you have to walk into the room. In the room is obviously all the machines, the IV poles, the ventilators, and everything. Obviously, what that means is that every time you enter a patient room, you need, when you're talking about a pandemic, you need to put on full protective equipment, full PPE, and then come out. You need to don when you go in, you need to doff when you come out. Obviously exhausting, and as you know, there was a shortage of PPE, so that was not efficient at all. So what we created is this kind of ICU. We quickly built, in a matter of 5 days, we built in our storage space, we built 2 huge sort of ICUs, as you see here in the top right. You see not the machines aren't there. The machines, as you can see here on the bottom left, the machines are in the hallway between these 2 temporary rooms. So what it enabled was for obviously there were always nurses inside, even though in this photo you don't see staff right here at this point, but it enabled a lot of the care to be done outside. For example, like changing IV bags and making it more efficient, less PPE and less nurses needed to be inside. So when you're talking about ICU, you can have 1 or 2 ICU nurses, for example, guiding 6 or 7 non-ICU nurses telling them what to do, how to do, and obviously ICU nurses inside, but it enabled a lot more efficient and enabled us to go through burning a lot less PPE. At the max, we had 250 COVID patients, with 50 of them being on mechanical ventilation. So that's massive. That's significantly more than Israeli hospitals, which, for example, like Sheba or Rambam, they're so much bigger, but they did not have at any point such a mass of patients. So just a quick look at PPE, at some of the various types that we had here. And in order to prevent also the staff from getting infected or from patients infecting others, even when we were transporting them, if it's from the emergency department to various floors, or from the floors for imaging, CAT scan, MRI, we created these covers. So our facilities team, I must say, was extremely creative in coming up with really quick and very effective solutions. So a little bit now into the treatment. So we're talking obviously about a new virus, a new disease. So how do we treat it? It's, so obviously investigational therapies. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar. Investigational could be that you're using a drug that's already used for other indications, but now you're using it on a new indication, or using completely new drugs that haven't been used before. So we'll talk about both categories. Just a few of the names that were more commonly used in March and April. A lot of them not being used so commonly anymore. So hydroxychloroquine, dexamethasone, and remdesivir, which are now quite the standard for hospitalized patients. Interleukin-6, which we were treating a lot, but obviously the results of quite a few studies were negative, so we rarely use it. Convalescent plasma, which we're not big fans of, not enough randomized controlled trials, but there have been large observation studies like what Mayo Clinic did. And obviously a lot of other biologic therapies, for example, the Regeneron anti-spike antibody, which I'll talk a tiny bit about later. So I think the best way maybe to give you a feel of what it is, boots on the ground, or again, the voice from the field, is an example of a patient that came in March. So I must say that this specific patient allows us also to use his full name. He presented to CNN, to BBC, so he's been all over the media, but I am so used to just using initials, so let me call him EP as a start. So EP, a 49-year-old male, basically healthy, married, and father of 3. This and that, in this room here, you see the arrow there, that is actually his bed. This is where he was in our temporary ICU, which, by the way, still exists because we're prepared in case we again have a massive amount of patients. So just a little bit of his history. So on March 16th, he was admitted to Holy Name after 5 days of fever, chills, cough, and shortness of breath. As was customary at the time, or common treatment, we started treating him with hydroxychloroquine, but after 4 more days, he deteriorated and was intubated and transferred to the ICU. At the time, this is again the very beginning of the pandemic, drugs like remdesivir were only available as compassionate use. Compassionate use means that it's for whoever's more familiar with Hebrews, tzipul chemla. You can only use it if you get specific approval from the regulatory authorities and the company. So with this specific patient, and at the time, by the way, another thing is today we use remdesivir before the patient's intubated, as they come to the ED and we're admitting them. But at the time, we were only allowed to use remdesivir for patients that were already intubated. So the moment that this patient, EP, got intubated, we requested from the FDA and from Gilead, the manufacturer of remdesivir, to use it. It took 3 days, but on the 23rd, we received it, and he started a 9-day course of the drug. In addition, he got high-dose steroids. And again, these 2 drugs at the time, we had no real data that they're effective. Even today, high-dose steroids, dexamethasone, seems to be quite effective. Remdesivir, limited. We do know that it reduces hospitalization from about 15 to 11 days, but there's really no magic bullet here. So 2 weeks later, there's no significant improvement. He's still in the ICU. So, and in the meantime, I'm hearing from friends and colleagues and from Pluristem, which I'm very familiar with because we've been using those cells for peripheral vascular disease, a totally different disease, totally different situation. But on beginning of October, 7 patients in Israel were treated with Pluristem for COVID. All of them survived at least a week. Again, very sick patients. So I thought to myself, I think that this might be a good idea. Now, let me just give you a quick overview of what's in it. At the end of the day, when you don't know what works on your patient, sometimes you go all the way back to mechanisms of action of drugs, because we have no idea what works for COVID. So what the concepts behind Pluristem, and I'll just go over this really fast, and placenta-based cells, is that basically when a mother is pregnant, mothers do not reject the embryo, even if, and it's obviously, it's like a foreign body because it's got the genetics of the father. There's obviously something in the placenta that tells the body to calm down, don't attack the embryo, so it can grow, develop. And those characteristics is what Pluristem is trying to achieve with COVID, because at the end of the day, you're all familiar that the cytokine storm, or past the viral phase, the cytokine storm or the hyperimmune reaction is what creates a lot of the harm. So interestingly, overnight, we were able to get FDA approval to use the Pluristem cells. And sorry, and I didn't even mention Pluristem, for those who don't know, is a company based in Haifa in Israel. So this whole technology is Israeli. So on the 11th, we received approval from the FDA to use it. Pluristem shipped it. They have the cells for other indications that they use in the US, and all of them investigational, but they were able to ship, and we treated. So these are just some photos of Vincent, our pharmacist, preparing the drug. It comes frozen. You need to defrost in the photo in the middle. You need to put it in syringes, and then about 15 syringes, we injected intramuscularly. Again, first patient in the US, 8th patient in the world, but we injected it in both the arms and the legs, again, intramuscular injections. Here you actually see me in the picture on the bottom right. I'm actually in that hallway where all the devices are. There's no reason for me, if all I'm doing is instructing the docs, I don't need to be in full PPE. As you see, the doctor that's injecting the patient, he is in full PPE. Because again, we were doing everything to not burn out PPE if not needed. So as it was the first case in the US, the media went wild. I'm sure you can understand that, whether on the internet, news, all the TV channels, and so forth. And I'm happy to show you, after 10 days, this is EP actually FaceTiming with his family. He's still here in the ICU, still with the tracheostomy, but he's not ventilated any longer. He's actually breathing on his own. And a few days, 2 days after that, he was able to be transferred to another department. And here he's, after 6 weeks being, in bed, like most patients, even healthy ones, you're deconditioned. Obviously, he couldn't get up, even so the physical therapist here helping him walk. And this is him leaving the hospital. This is his mother hugging him. His wife and 3 kids are also there in the background. And this is him with his wife, Pixie, and 3 kids. So, Obviously, it's always great to show the wonderful stories, but you have here a truly rewarding case. Unfortunately, not all patients ended up, and not all stories had such a great happy ending. But just quickly to share, he is the most famous Broadway set designer. His name is Edward Pierce. And he's feeling great. He's just a little upset that Broadway is still closed, and you know, no one's seeing any shows at this point, but with a lot of hope that things are going to get better. So quick transfer to a little bit about the anti-spike antibodies. So you're familiar, there's Regeneron, and there's also the Lilly antibodies. On June 10th this year, here at Holy Name, we were the first in the world to use the Regeneron anti-spike antibody on patients in the investigational setup, of course. On September 29th, there was preliminary data showing reduction in viral load and symptoms, and a very favorable safety profile for these antibodies. It was only shown on 275 patients, but that was enough for the doctors, the physicians of President Trump, to decide to treat him with this, and that's when it made all the noise. But on October 2nd, he was injected as compassionate use. President Trump did not take part in the study. He got the real thing, no placebo. Just recently, November 21st, the FDA gave emergency use authorization, but to outpatient use for patients that are positive, but they're outpatients. They have minimal symptoms. Once you're hospitalized, there's no emergency use authorization. Patients are still being treated in the setup of a clinical trial. So a third of them do get placebo. So now I want to transfer a little and talk about the status of COVID here, and a little bit of touch on the status of vaccines. So just a quick comparison between New Jersey and Israel. So probably some of you know that the population and size of Israel and New Jersey are comparable. Both have about 9 million. The population is about 9 million. And the size, Israel is a little bigger with 22,000 square kilometers. New Jersey is about 19,000. But take a look at the death rate. And this is as of end of last week. In Israel, there were 2,839 deaths. And in New Jersey, those documented, because at the beginning it was chaotic. So I believe that it's actually quite a bit higher than that. But formally, 16,925. That's 6 times more death for the same population. So obviously, we have not done as well as a state, obviously, and not as a country. Obviously, everyone's familiar with that, compared to Israel. Just a little bit of what's going on now. As you can see right now, New Jersey is at a peak, which is a little bit coming to some kind of plateauing. Let's hope it quickly plateaus and indeed goes down. In Israel, as you're all aware, there was the first peak, then the second peak, and which really went to numbers as high as 10,000 new patients a day. And you all know that there was a lockdown, and eventually now the rates are between about 900 and 1,000 new cases a day. So when we talk about vaccines, you got to look at the various components. I like to call it the vaccine triad. You've got the recipients, or the patients if you want, but a lot of them are healthy individuals. So recipients would be a better term. You've got the various vaccine candidates, and you've got the various providers. And let's see what needs to be done to understand what are the various components that we now need to work with once that these vaccines get approved. So Dr. Edelstein did speak about some of these things in his talk, so I'm not going to go over much, but I do, the leading compounds now, Moderna and Pfizer, pay attention to the temperature, and I think Dr. Edelstein shortly spoke about this last week. You got -20 for Moderna, but for the Pfizer vaccine, you need -70. So obviously there's a lot of logistics because most hospitals, or a lot of them at least, do not even have -70s, not to talk about various pharmacies and other nursing homes or other places where potentially you would want to give this. Now, there's no way in the US today to buy -70 freezers because they've all been bought, delivered, and there's not that many anyways manufactured. And now there's orders for at least the next 5-6 months. But happy to say at Holy Name, yes, we have our -70, 80 freezer. So we cleaned it out and we're ready here. And that's a major, even though it's only a freezer, that's a major element in being prepared. So happy to, there's enough room there for probably at least 1,000, maybe even 1,500 vaccine doses. So when we're talking about the providers, I don't want to go too much into all these elements, but when we provide the vaccine, there's obviously a lot of questions. Where do we do it? Who does it? And who oversees the whole process, which is massive? So where do you do it? The system in the US is different than in Israel. In Israel, you have your hospitals, which are more the acute care, maybe rehab, but then you have all the kupot cholim, the sick funds that manage the patients in the community. In the US, it's a little different. A lot of hospitals have actually acquired a lot of primary care clinics that are in the community, and now hospitals, and it's been a process in the last 10, 20 years. Now a lot of hospitals are actually also managing the community. The insurance companies, as opposed to the sick funds in Israel, the insurance companies handle the finances. They do not handle the care. So it's a very different system. But obviously there are similarities when it comes to providing a vaccine. So where are we going to provide it? In hospitals and clinics, physician practices, urgent care facilities, nursing homes. There's so many options. In the US, there's one more place that's very common to get vaccines, and that's in the various retail pharmacies, CVS, Walgreens, and all those. So who? And I think also Dr. Edelstein spoke briefly last week about who are the various providers that can provide the vaccine. So obviously nurses, nurse practitioners, very common in the US, physician assistants called PAs, potentially physicians. But what about others that do not commonly provide vaccine? Paramedics, pharmacists, medical assistants, different volunteers. In the US, you're probably familiar with the whole financial and liability aspect. It's going to be a problem to get more people because of the liability, and you know that a lot of things end with suing. So there's going to be a lot of issues on who can and who cannot give this. Also, in terms of the oversight, so there's the federal government that handles all these emergency use authorizations. Probably the federal government at some point, maybe end of December, beginning of January, will probably approve for use either Moderna or Pfizer, maybe AstraZeneca. But there are also state governments here in the US. So perhaps the federal government is going to let the states manage vaccine distribution. And then obviously there's the insurance companies, hospitals, and pharmacies. So it's not even clear at this point where we're approaching the finish line with these vaccines, or at least the initial distribution. At this point, we don't even know who's going to receive. We do know that hospitals will receive a vaccine, but what does it mean that a hospital receives vaccines? How do I, for example, provide vaccines in a nursing home where I don't have any authority? I don't follow the patients there. What if there are, for example, side effects? Who documents? Who reports? There's a lot of logistic issues on, even if hospitals do get the majority of the vaccines that come out, let's say in January, How is that going to happen? We don't know yet. And that's actually, I don't think it would be an understatement to say that it's quite terrifying, because even if we're talking about a few thousands of vaccines at the beginning, we still don't know how it's going to be handled. For us as a hospital, yeah, it's going to be relatively easy to vaccinate our employees, those that at least agree to take the vaccine. But let's talk about also about the recipients and see the various issues that we have there too. So, so who's going to receive priority? From the CDC website, we know that healthcare personnel, which totally makes sense, with different workers in essential and in the critical different industries, people that are high risk for COVID-19 complications. So obviously those would also, that would be patients with chronic diseases and people that are 65 years and older. So that's the initial list of who's going to get first priority. And it says on the website, it says groups considered for early vaccination if supply is limited. We know that supply is going to be limited. So another question in New Jersey, and we don't have the answer yet, is will the vaccine be mandatory for healthcare personnel? So just so you all know, the flu vaccine is mandatory here in the state of New Jersey. So I would say 96% of the healthcare workers are vaccinated already this year for flu. Is that what the New Jersey government is going to do with the COVID vaccine? We don't know. But it always does get a lot of negative noise because people, even healthcare workers, do not want it to be mandated. But when it's not mandated, I can say that the rate of flu vaccinations was about 43%, similar to what it usually is in Israel. And that's not high enough, but that's how it's been in the last several years. So continuing to mention the recipient. So is the public willing to receive the vaccine? So if you look at the top graph here, and this is from Gallup, just a recent question or poll that was out in the public. So around July, 66% of people were willing to take it. It went down to a low of 50% of adults that were asked around mid-September. But now it's going up again. I think people are really starting to understand in the US that this is a serious disease. And so it's gone up to 58%. So that's not high. That's not high enough. Definitely not enough to eventually achieve herd immunity. And we understand that without a vaccine, we're never going to reach herd immunity. So, and we've seen that also in different countries. Just a quick, just a bit more from the Gallup panel here. So what are the reasons that people in the US do not want to take the vaccine? So obviously they're concerned about the rush timelines. 26 want to confirm that it's safe before they take it. 12% think that they don't trust vaccines in general. And another 10% want to see how effective it is before they get treated. So obviously the recipients also are an issue here when it comes to this. And just quickly to summarize, again from the CDC website, but the CDC hasn't communicated beyond their website a lot of direct communication to the hospital. In many cases, it's what we get is letters that are exactly identical to what's on the website. So, so there's really not much news. It's just they do want to find a way to report the vaccine inventory, administration, who it gets administered to. I didn't even mention, I think Michael did the problem, Dr. Edelstein mentioned. Another problem is that most of these vaccines, you need to be vaccinated twice in a gap of about a month. So that's also logistically, that's a huge issue. You vaccinate patients once, how are you going to make sure they're going to come? It's not, we don't always have a relationship with these patients like a primary care doctor does, for example. So that's a major issue. Who's going to report? How are we going to report who gets it? What is going to be the digital platform that we're going to be using? Or is it going to be manual on paper? We really don't have answers to a lot of that. And like I said, that's concerning. So that's about what I would like to present, but I'm more than happy to receive questions and provide my insight on other things.
Great. Dr. Barkama, thank you very much. A great presentation, and it's also useful to remember that it's not all about vaccines, and vaccines are only, they're an additional tool to other innovations and also existing procedures that are in place. Can I ask you to unshare your screen so we can see
Sure.
everyone?
Sorry.
And if you have questions for Dr. Barkama, please type them in the chat, and I'll start going through them. So one question is the sort of complementary role of vaccines versus antibody therapy. I'm just wondering, how do you, as someone who's very involved in innovative treatments, and you mentioned the spike antibody, how do you see, assuming that the vaccines are safe and effective, how do you see the sort of the role of both? How do they work together?
So currently, first of all, the majority of the perspective in the role of the antibodies is in treatment. But in a moment, I'll talk about the prevention aspect too. So most of the studies of these are outpatients that are positive and usually have even minimal symptoms, or patients who are hospitalized. That's where most of the data is. So that's why even the emergency use authorization for both Lilly and Regeneron anti-spike antibodies, they are for outpatients. Outpatients are ambulatory patients which are already positive. However, there's also a study, and we're taking part, which is for household contacts. So if you have someone in the family that is positive, all the other family members, and again, it's only for household contacts, can receive the antibody. Right now, it's a 1-to-1 randomization in this study, to see if it's also good at preventing the disease, or if not preventing, at least if the household contacts get infected, to have a very mild disease. When we're talking about a vaccine, we're totally talking about, at this point, about prevention. And so there is some overlap, I must say, if you paint those Venn diagrams, there is some overlap, but I would say that the antibodies are more on the treatment side and the vaccine is more on the prevention. Would you agree with that, Dr. Edelstein?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. I was also thinking about the sort of prophylactic role of antibodies, like you use immunoglobulins, for example, whether there's a role for this kind of use for antibodies for people.
So immunoglobulins, IVIG right now, we're only using more for the for Kawasaki-like disease. Right. That's where it's mainly used. The others are like convalescent plasma, and the other use of antibodies is, except for anti-spike antibodies and a few other things that are being studied, right now we're being used for treatment.
Great. The next question is from Milton Zigerman, and he's asking about the age of participants in clinical trials, and I'm not sure whether it refers to vaccine trials or therapeutic trials, but the question is saying that the over 65 are considered the high-risk population and the priority population, but clinical trials are often geared towards lower age population. Are there any concerns with the effects or side effects of vaccine or treatments in the elderly population? Is that being factored for in the design of trials?
So I must say that is a major concern, and it is true that most clinical trials, they initially go to the more healthier population, especially when you're talking about vaccines. And yes, I agree that extrapolating from these vaccine trials to children or to the elderly is very troubling. From my understanding, all these vaccine trials do have to have some, at least a limited number or a percentage of patients that are above an age, but for very sick patients, they usually don't take part in these vaccines trials. So I agree, this is very concerning.
And what about on the trials on the treatment side? Is there a similar issue, or?
Less, but also for the very frail, there's always an exclusion criteria that does not enable us to treat them. But then we have to understand that a lot of these treatments were initially also tried on patients that are intubated, for example, so they're very ill. It is important, though, to mention that these anti-spike antibodies, they're like antivirals. They're good at the beginning of the disease. Once the cytokine storm or the hyperimmune reaction, when that starts, the anti-spike antibody doesn't help anymore, because the anti-spike antibody, what it does is it prevents the virus to enter the human cell. So that is classic for the viral phase. So, so as patients get sicker and sicker, it's showing that it's less effective. So whether you're younger or older, healthier or sicker, it doesn't work.
Thank you. The next question is from Professor Skoretsky. He's asking about, this is really about patient management, but what do you do with ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers in COVID-19 patients because of the role of ACE2?
Yeah, basically, we usually continue with the regular blood pressure treatment that the patients come with. And that's, I think, the common practice among most medical centers today. And I'm not familiar if it's been studied in a clinical trial of changing these, stopping and giving other hypertensives, but we usually continue the use of them.
Okay, thank you. The next question is not an easy question. I'm going to slightly rephrase it. As you're I think the only American speaker on the series, if I'm not wrong, I think I'm right. I was just wondering whether you could comment on the role of the CDC in this crisis, and particularly from your perspective as you know, coming from the hospital angle, whether that's, I mean, you know, from outside, it's obviously been very different, and the CDC hasn't been as prominent as in other crises. But how has that affected, you know, the management of the crisis from the hospital perspective? I have to say that I'm just going to read the original question, which is, where has the CDC in the US been through this crisis? But I've tried to make it more diplomatic.
Yeah. So unfortunately, this crisis has really been has been polluted with a lot of politics, and I would say that that's the case also in Israel. And by the way, I know I sound American, but I must state I'm Israeli. But I grew up as a kid a few years here, so I sort of, and now in the last 12 years I've been here. But I'm a proud Israeli, just to clarify. But I'm also proud to live in the U.S. I can't though call myself American. It's a major issue where the CDC, like Misad Habriyut, have a lot of pressure from various politicians and stuff. And I do think that the voice of the CDC has not been heard enough, has not been robust enough. And I do, though, applaud people like Fauci who do come out and say what they truly do think. But that's one positive person among a lot of people that are very nervous about their jobs. And you got to remember this, everyone knows this was an election year. Just think how many people today in the government, or whether CDC, CMS, all the HHS in the US, they're afraid about their jobs. They don't know what the Biden administration, some of them are regular civil servants. They're going to stay in their jobs. But a lot of them are just like in Israel. Their politicians have provided them their jobs. So it's hard to know what's going to happen. I do hope the politicization of COVID management in the US, and I hope it happens fast, is going to drop, and it's going to be a lot more professionally managed.
Great. There's a question from Joseph Weigel about immunization in healthcare workers, and I'm just wondering whether we can elaborate a little bit. One thing that was quite interesting in your slide from the Gallup poll was actually most of the hesitancy towards the COVID vaccine. What the proportion of people who are generally against vaccine was much lower than the proportion of people who are hesitating to be vaccinated against COVID, and the main reason was I think given was, you know, the feeling that it's been rushed. And what we've seen from the second talk in our series is actually, even though the timelines have been compressed, that there's no compromise on safety as such. What do you think, particularly thinking of healthcare workers in a hospital setting, communications wise, how can what do we need to do? Is mandation the right way, or do we need to take a different approach to vaccination, to voluntary vaccination to improve intention to vaccinate?
So there are very few states in the US that mandate various vaccines. So it's going to be tough. And that's exactly why I gave the example of New Jersey, which does mandate flu vaccines for healthcare workers. That doesn't go without, without negative public opinion. Is that what's going to happen with COVID? At this point, I don't know. But I must say that when we did a very preliminary poll in our hospital, just asking the various healthcare workers if they would like to be among the first to receive the vaccine, about 40% said no. So we're talking about 60% positivity that that healthcare workers will be among the first ones. I'm not saying that they didn't. Some said later on they're okay if the vaccine comes out in January, they're okay getting it in the summer. But that's a problem, because if we also want to think about healthcare workers as an example to the public, if we cannot provide a good example of people that go ahead and get vaccinated, that's going to be a problem. But I would think the exact same is going to happen in Israel. I'm not sure that healthcare workers, physicians, nurses in hospitals are going to be happy to be among the first that are going to get the vaccine. What are your thoughts?
Well, from the few studies that I've seen in Israel, it's very similar. I think, there is reticence, particularly because it's not so much, a sort of anti-vaccine sentiment. It's very specific to the COVID-19 vaccine because of the uncertainty around safety and efficacy. And I think you're asking me my personal view. I think a lot of this is a failure of communication. The idea that the compression of the timelines means that the product is either not as effective or not as safe as a regular, the regular development of vaccines, which really is not necessarily the case. So I think that there could be some better work around what developing a vaccine in a year means, and that's why we had a whole talk dedicated to this early on in this series. The next question is about the -80 degrees refrigerator, and I think it's just a clarification. The question is, why do you have this? What is going to be the role of the hospital that requires having this -80 degrees fridge? Is it for to vaccinate healthcare workers? Is it because you want to do with it?
So you cut off a little bit, but I think just tell me if this was indeed the question. So what would be the role of our -80 freezer? Would it be to vaccinate healthcare workers, or also some patients and the public? So Is that indeed what you asked? Because yeah, I think his internet connection. So I'll answer that question, hoping that was indeed the question. So first, yes, it would be for the healthcare workers. Here at Holy Name, for example, we have over 3,000 employees, but it would also be to vaccinate the patients. And as I was saying, hospitals today have a lot of practices that are in the community. So we manage we manage over 30,000 lives, for example. That's how they call it lives or people in the community through what could be called, it's called Accountable Care Organization. It's one of the Obamacare sort of entities. And so basically it would also be to use on the general public. Again, assuming that there's room in that fridge for 1,500, as we vaccinate, we're hoping we'll get more and more of those vaccines. So it would be, again, for us and for others, of course. You're on mute, Dr. Edelstein.
We seem to have lost our internet connection at the university, so I cut off, and I think Professor Squaresy cut off as well, but I'm back. I've lost the questions though in the chat, so I remember a couple more, so I will ask you, and if you do have additional ones, please ask them. We still have a few minutes. There was one question about your experience in the hospital of long-term effects of COVID-19, sort of post-acute infection, and what has your experience been?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing post-COVID syndrome. We're seeing from weakness through different more shortness of breath on exertion in people that were even healthy before. So we're seeing also people that are saying that just like I'm sure you're hearing in Israel, that they're having less ability to concentrate, they're losing words. We're seeing older people that are talking about more dementia. So yeah, there's definitely, we haven't seen anyone, for example, with the Kawasaki-like, but we treat mainly adults here, less children. But yes, we're definitely seeing quite a lot. A lot of our doctors are saying that, a lot of our primary care docs are saying that a lot of patients are coming with a wide variety of symptoms that do get better, but don't go away. So, and we're already talking from March, and now we're already end of November. So that's, yeah, that's a long time. So, and we don't know. I'd like to be able to reassure everyone that it's going to go away, but in some cases, probably not. I mean, from the chest x-rays that we see on the patients that were extremely sick, we are seeing real harm and damage to lungs that in some cases, you probably heard, in some cases, people even have to go through a lung transplant because it's just not much is left of healthy lung tissue.
And in terms of, I mean, in terms of vaccine acceptance, what do you think, you know, this post-COVID-19 syndrome, is it an important incentive to vaccinate? Is it something we could use as a communication element to encourage vaccination? Is that something that you
definitely? I think we're going to have to use everything we possibly can to promote the public to get vaccinated. So it's about the disease itself. It's about infecting others. It's about the post-COVID. We're going to have to take the whole spectrum of all the bad things and put it in and reflect it in front of everyone through media, through personal discussions, through giving doctors the tools to convince their patients, through in schools, at churches, at synagogues, at every single, I don't think that there is anything that should not be outside of the game or outside of the board to what we use or don't use against COVID and to try to get the vaccine out there. Right. We're not going to reach herd immunity if we don't really give it our best.
No, I agree. The last question is on the role of the hospital as as a vaccination center, and you mentioned that, you know, maybe in the US it's a little bit more common. I mean, in you know, in the UK or in Israel, it's not really the place you go to get your vaccine. But we're talking about a vaccination, you know, on a scale that is potentially unprecedented. I mean, flu is very big. COVID might be bigger if we start vaccinating, you know, risk groups and at-risk adults, with potentially, when enough doses become available, the whole population. What are the implications for hospitals in terms of workforce, in terms of logistics? How does a hospital prepare for something like this?
So at this point, we're already giving it thoughts. And again, we're hoping that we'll able to use volunteers, for example, retired nurses, and a lot, and be able to enhance our workforce such that we'll be able to put up a tent or use a whole building, one of our buildings just for that. But exactly how, and one more thing, one of the limiting factors is the amount of vaccine that we're going to get. So, so I don't think it's that at one morning we're going to have 30,000 people, because if slowly we're getting the amounts, we're not going to just have come to Holy Name and you'll get vaccinated. No, we're going to have to do it probably through the various other entities like primary care doctors that are gonna send, let's say, 10 patients at a time, and they know the patient, so they'll choose the more chronically ill, those that are at higher risk, to come to the hospital. Potentially we'll be able to bring vaccines also to primary care offices so they can give it there. But again, if the patient doesn't show up and they're supposed to, and what do you do? And you got to bring it back to potentially to the freezer. And there are a lot of logistic issues where it's not just a US thing, it's going to be everywhere in the world. And us in the Western world, we're quite spoiled because we do have some of these freezers. How are we going to go and vaccinate areas where they're not so lucky to have the things that we have? So, and this is a global pandemic, so we have to think globally, not just US, Israel, and Europe, you know. So there's a lot of questions, and I unfortunately, for a lot of things, I do not have the answers.
Great. We're almost out of time. So Dr. Barkama, thank you very much. I think it's a great way to conclude our series. We started at the very high kind of global level with Professor Heyman, and we're finishing on, you know, the actual real life implications at the forefront of the fight against COVID. So thank you very much. And it was a great talk. I would like to hand over to Professor Skoretsky to close the session and also actually close the series.
Thank you. I'd like to echo Professor Edelstein's expression of appreciation to you, Dr. Barkama, Ravit. It was great and really absolutely a perfect way to hear from firsthand, frontline experience based on cutting-edge innovation, plus global public health knowledge, all wrapped into a very, very fine session. Thank you very much. And indeed, it does culminate a month-long series of 5 excellent webinars, I think, covering the most interesting topical aspects of a challenge, which is really a beginning of where we need to go next, what lessons we're going to need to learn for the future. And with that, I'd also like to thank Bar-Ilan University and President Daria Saban, who basically thought of the idea of having this webinar, tied it to the recruitment of Dr. Edelstein a month ago, and Michael rose to the occasion without hesitancy, no vaccine hesitancy, no webinar hesitancy, no hesitancy at all. And before we could turn around, it was a fine webinar series with superb speakers of very high caliber, including tonight's speaker, of course. And Michael, that reflects, I think, your passion, compassion, connection, and scholarly level, and Bar-Ilan's scholarly level, and our care for global human health. So with that, I bring the series to a close. And again, I'm sure we may want to meet up again in a couple of months, perhaps, or something, Michael. We'll see when there's more information, perhaps decisions, policy decisions that are being made, we may wish to comment on, revisit some of these issues. And I want to wish everyone, of course, continued good health, well-being, strength to continue the important work everyone on this call is doing, each in their own way, to bring relief and a solution, whether it be in the social sphere, in the research discovery sphere, and everyone in their own way, to end this pandemic and learn from it. So thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good night to all, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.